Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another wonderful biology class, or the second half of one, rather. We're going to pick up where we left off, looking at uh, anthropogenic changes. Anthropogenic changes. Fortunately, this isn't one of your vocabulary, because that's kind of a terrible word, but it actually just means human changes to the environment. And these include all kinds of things, such as habitat loss, pollution, the introduction of invasive species. These are species or organisms that are not native to an area, overexploitation, and climate change. These changes can have disruptive effects on the ecosystem. Some can have beneficial effects. That can be said. It's kind of rare, but it can, and has a lot to do with how purposeful humans are about the changes that they're making. But these changes are oftentimes used as a cudgel to, disabuse people of having more children and to say how bad and wicked and terrible humans are as a whole. And to be fair, some things humans have done to the environment have been pretty horrific, so fair game. Humans are changing conditions on Earth. I think that can be said fairly, and I think everyone can agree. The only debate is the extent to which we're changing them, the extent to which the changes are reversible, and the extent to which the changes are dangerous to us and the Earth as a whole. Now, one of the changes that we make most often is to get access to or to create more natural resources. These are things from nature that can range from useful plants, things that we eat, plants that we have for medicine, to animals that we eat, to raw materials like fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas that we harvest from the environment around us. And the harvesting of natural resources obviously is going to disrupt the environment. In fact, that cell phone you're holding right now is made with a lithium ion battery, more than likely, which is harvested by destroying a huge amount of mountainous environment to get that heavy metal lithium, which is found only under the Earth's crust, right? So, like with coal that we have to mine up out of the ground, all of those lithium metals usually come from some kind of mass pit mining, and it's very destructive to the environment. So, natural resources and their acquisition are very important for human thriving. Having that cell phone can be very, very useful. It's a connection to basically the totality of human knowledge if you know where to look. And that can't be underscored enough. That's really great stuff. But there's no free lunch, there's only trade offs, right? There's only costs that you're willing to pay and costs that you're not willing to pay. And so, for everything in life that you have that comes from nature, there's a cost in acquiring whatever that is. That natural resource has a value to it. And some part of the environment is going to be destroyed because you want that natural resource. And that's just the way it is. The only way for that not to be so is for you to not have that thing or that food or that desire met that you want. Otherwise, you're going to disturb or destroy some or all of an environment to get to the resource that you want. Now, overexploitation, I think, can be agreed, is the worst possible version of harvesting resources from the natural world. Okay, so I've got this very creative jack-o'-lantern fellow here who is harvesting pumpkins, maybe way too much because he has an obsession with making jack-o'-lanterns. And so he clear-cut an entire forest, planted only a pumpkin patch, and now harvests pumpkins to make into his jack-o'-lanterns day and night. Okay, it's a very silly scenario, but that's kind of what overexploitation is, right? You take some aspect or ecosystem, some part of the world, and you absolutely decimate it for the sole purpose of extracting whatever resource you want. And it turns out with nature that if you extract things somewhat slowly or in small areas and you kind of progressively move and you give nature a little bit of time, nature will recover itself pretty quickly, right? So that strip mining for lithium, if you only have a small mine and you slowly move it over time and you leave what you've mined through alone, over a couple of decades, the poisonous materials that you've dredged up, along with the lithium that you want, will eventually seep back down into the rock, and plants will grow over on top of it. Soil will um, develop, and some plants will even take up some of the poisonous materials into the roots. And when that plant dies, it goes into the soil. Like, nature has ways of repairing itself from being disturbed. It's actually quite good at it, better than we give it credit for, I dare say. But overexploitation is when you just don't give nature a chance to repair itself from the injury you are causing when you're extracting the resources that you want or need. And that overexploitation generally leads to habitat loss or species loss. And habitat loss, I think the best, most obvious visual example of habitat loss was a practice called clear cutting. So, in the 1900s, you would have loggers who would go into a forest and they would literally just cut down the entire forest. It's called clear cutting. And so you'd walk to a mountain and you'd see nothing but tree stumps because every tree was cut down. Now, that's almost been completely outlawed in most post-industrialized nations, and what's called sustainable logging has been implemented. So for every tree you cut down, you plant a new tree, and you kind of go in a like a row, and you harvest around a tree field, and you kind of replace the trees as you chop them down. And if you do that, then, as I was saying before, nature has a chance to repair itself as you're harvesting the resource. So you don't necessarily have to stop harvesting the natural resource. You just have to collect it in a way that gives nature a chance to repair itself. Now, an example the book gives is the hunting of sea lions that used to feed on seals, that used to feed on sea anemones. And seals and sea lions were valued very highly for their fat, which could then be used for oil and lanterns. And so many seals and sea lions were killed off. As a result, a plant organism called a sea anemone began to populate the ocean out of control, and it was destroying a lot of different plant species that grew near the coastlines. And that was messing up the fisheries that were sustained on feeding on the plants. So, because everything is actually kind of connected in ecosystems, when you wipe out one species or drastically reduce the population of one species, it can really affect the overall ecosystem. Another example is whaling that was done in the waters in between Russia and Japan, where whales were almost killed off entirely. And it was thought that that would lead to more fish in those waters because the whales that eat them were no longer there to eat them. But it turns out the number of fish in those fisheries, that area was called a fishery, declined precipitously. And when whales were reintroduced, lo and behold, the number of fish in those fisheries actually went up pretty considerably. It turns out that whales, have whale poop. And whale poop floats to the surface and has a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus in it. And plankton and phytoplankton grow from those nutrients, and the fish eat those, and those small fish get eaten by bigger fish. And there's a whole ecosystem, a food chain, that is related to big chunks of whale poop that float in the water. So, a couple of examples here of why species diversity is so important, and how just perturbing one species in an ecosystem can lead to really hard changes in the ecosystem, a lot of difficulties. Now, habitat fragmentation is an interesting occurrence, and it results when humans cut paths like roads through an ecosystem, right? You fragment it, you cut it up into pieces. And it's a problem because of something known as the edge effect. There are some organisms that will only live in a deep forest. And the less deep forest there is, because you're slicing up your paths, or you're cutting your roads through the forest, leaving a little edge to the forest, the less habitat there are for those deep forest organisms to live, and that's called the edge effect. Now, there are some species that happily live in the edges of forests and what paths humans have cut through them, but not all do. And so, if you chunk up your land into very, very small pieces, then, like at the center of this picture down here, it's all edge and there's no deep forest. And so, those species that require a deep forest environment to live can't live here. They can only live in the deep forest. So, habitat fragmentation is a problem because of the edge effect, not necessarily because we're getting rid of the habitat, but because we're making the area of the habitat smaller by cutting it up into chunks. Now, climate change is kind of a hot button topic, and I want to be as objective as I can be because it does look like the Earth's temperature is rising pretty slowly. Over time, over my lifetime, I think it's fair to say the Earth's temperature has risen by a couple of degrees on average. And the rate of severe weather does seem to be increasing somewhat in most regions of the world. I think that's all fair to say. Now, is the world going to end because of climate change in 12 years, as some politicians have suggested? No, I really don't think so. But it is something we need to pay attention to because it leads to things like ocean acidification. It does seem to lead to somewhat stronger storms. It is going to lead to changing in weather patterns, and it's going to require humans to adapt. I'm not going to be a black pillar and say that the ice caps are going to melt in the next 12 years and coastal cities will be gone. I think that's a bit hyperbolic. I think humans are very good at adapting to climate change, and we've shown that over the last 40 years, where not only have we not hit the famines and droughts that were predicted when I was young, but we have found great ways to create desalination plants and to make water as a resource, and we produce more food now than just about at any time. Well, more food at any time in my lifetime, and I'd say any time in history. So climate change is something to think about. It is something to be concerned about and to be aware of. But how we solve it, you know, doesn't necessarily have to be we just stop using fossil fuels. There are a lot of alternative hypotheses on how we could geoengineer the planet through things like seeding clouds over the open ocean to increase the reflective properties of the Earth and lower the global temperature. And a positive side effect of more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that most people don't talk about is the fact that plants grow faster and crop yields actually increase when there's more CO2. So careful consideration and not being swayed by fear mongering, I think, is prudent. I don't want to understate the fact that it is happening and that it's a real event, but I do want to say that careful policy discussion, critical thinking, alternative paths of exploration and manipulation of the environment should be entertained. I think at 9 billion people that we are well within the realistic reasons to start geoengineering pretty heavily. But I'm not a doomer. I don't think that the world's going to come to a crashing end. And frankly, I don't think that many economies can handle the transition that is necessary to actually stop it, right? I think most post-industrialized nations have already addressed climate change pretty heavily. And those nations that still are producing tremendous amounts of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, they're not in a place economically to stop. And so you have some really real human issues at play that will need to be solved before this can be tackled realistically. And so in the meantime, I think we should probably look at some methods of geoengineering until the industrializing and pre-industrialized world can make its necessary transition. Because it turns out that as technology advances, the amount of pollution and carbon dioxide and those sorts of things tends to just decline as a result of technology. And I'm also a big believer in that technologies Like, I'm a big fan of hydrogen gas and hydrogen fuel cells and hydrogen powered engines. Go Toyota. I think technology can really change the world in big and profound ways, and that human thriving can continue without um, causing a lot of suffering. And yeah, don't panic about climate change. The world's not going to end. Your life probably won't end. Well, I mean, you're going to die eventually. Facts. But it's not going to be because of climate change in the next 12 years. It might be a car crash. It might be a plane crash. It might be some strange disease we've never heard of. But climate change, as important and as serious an issue as it is, shouldn't be a thing that keeps you up at night. It should be something that you address in your personal life through using less and being a more modest person in terms of consumption. And I think if everybody did that, it might actually just kind of disappear overnight. Now, pollution. Pollution is something we're all kind of guilty of because every time you buy something, it comes wrapped in plastic. And plastic is made from hydrocarbons, made from oils and natural gases, and other sorts of materials that are harvested from the earth. And through chemical reactions that release substances, gases that are not great for the environment. And so you can pollute the air, you can pollute the oceans, you can pollute water, you can pollute land. A lot of the land where the lithium batteries for your cell phone and these beautiful electric cars are coming from are going to be polluted for at least a decade because lithium is poisonous to the environment. And the places that it's being mined are going to have little trace amounts of that lithium in it. And it's going to cause sickness and disease for the people who live there for at least a decade until the lithium has a chance to seep back into the earth and be covered up by new soil, right? Or to leach out into the ocean and then slowly fall to the bottom of the ocean because it's a heavier element. It should naturally settle out over long periods of time. But pollution is a natural consequence of human activity, right? It's just something that's somewhat unavoidable. The way you avoid pollution is the same way you avoid climate change. And the answer is through consuming less personally, right? Through being less extravagant, through not having the latest iPhone, through modest living. And if everybody did that, then 9 billion people won't be a problem because the technology is getting better and better and better. And the alternatives to fossil fuels are getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And at some point, we'll hit a bit of a tipping point, and we'll be able to use things like a combination of nuclear power and hydrogen fuel cells or hydrogen gas powered engines, where carbon dioxide is not actually produced by anything but breathing, just cellular respiration, as nature has been doing it for the entirety of the history of the Earth. So, again, how panicked should you be? Should you be just waking up every night in chills and terror that the Earth's coming to a cataclysmic end? No. The only thing that's going to bring the Earth to a cataclysmic end anytime soon is a nuclear war, which, I mean, could happen. But the environment has either evolved to be, or in my opinion, is well designed to be very resilient. It recovers from perturbance very, very well, amazingly fast. And so, deep breath, it's gonna be okay. Just be a modest person in terms of what you consume and what you need. And I think that this problem, along with climate change, will mostly, not completely, but mostly solve itself. Now, biological magnification is an interesting issue, and it's one that's a little more complicated than just pollution and climate change. Because what biological magnification is when you put a chemical out into nature and an organism eats it, remember, as you go up trophic levels, the organism has to eat more of the organism below it to get the amount of energy and biomass that it needs to survive. Well, let's say that I kill 50 mosquitoes with an insecticide. Well, a bird, each one of those mosquitoes has a very small amount of the insecticide, but the bird comes along and eats 50 of those mosquitoes to stay alive. It now has 50 mosquitoes worth of that insecticide inside itself now. The concentration of the pollutant, the poison that we use to kill the insects, has increased. It's gone up, it's magnified. And that's what biological magnification is. And this is a bit of a difficult one because in the United States, for at least 2 or 3 decades, they used a chemical called DDT in amounts that were frankly absurd. They had trucks that would roll down streets in Florida and the American South that sprayed just tons of this DDT all over the place. And the mosquito population in the United States went to near zero. They didn't kill every mosquito, but it dropped to a point where they were rare and almost non existent. And in the process of doing this, they basically wiped out in the United States for several decades after mosquito borne illnesses. Well, it turns out that the birds that were eating all of the dead mosquitoes that died from this DDT, well, they started having slightly thinner eggshells. And so it was worried that over longer periods of time, if this persisted, you would start having birds die because they were being poisoned by the effects of biological magnification, and so it was outlawed. Now, I think one of the greatest tragedies in human history is that non-industrialized countries in Africa that really could have benefited from this very cheap and easy to manufacture insecticide were not allowed to do so because it was internationally outlawed. And so tens of thousands, maybe millions of people died in Africa because of malaria, which is a mosquito-borne disease. The consequence of saving those people would have been biological magnification and possibly harming some of the biodiversity in their environments. But was the cost in human life to save the environment worth it? I'm not so sure. I think it was actually quite a terrible tragedy that was perpetrated on the African continent because of a desire to save nature. So it was an instance where nature was put before man. And I advocate for human thriving before nature conservation. But a lot of conservationists, a lot of people would very much disagree with me, and that's fair. That's a debate that people should have. It's a discussion you should have, and it's something you should definitely think about. Now, a lot of times when bad things get out into the environment, they can become concentrated in terms of precipitation. So things like sulfur dioxide and nitrogen dioxide, when they are released because of the burning of fossil fuels, they can become concentrated in precipitation and cause what's called acid rain. This, for the most part, again, in most post-industrial countries, has been pretty well done away with. It's only in pre-industrializing and industrializing nations that do a lot of manufacturing, burn a lot of coal, where this is still an issue. And even in modern countries like the United States that still burn some coal, the way coal is burned, it's called clean coal. We can argue about how clean it really is, but the exhaust from the coal is processed to a degree that a lot of that is taken out of it. And so a lot of the pollution is decreased in terms of sulfur dioxide and nitrogen dioxide. And so there's much less, if any, acid rain or acid precipitation from it. All right. We're just about to wrap up here. I think I've waxed eloquent a little bit too long. Sorry about that. So I'll hit the last topic, which is eutrophication. Now, when we think of pollutants, we oftentimes think of things that are dangerous to the environment. Well, it turns out that sometimes nutrients can also be dangerous to the environment, and farmers will put a lot of phosphorus and nitrogen as fertilizer onto their crops. And the upside to this is crop yields have gone way up. This is how we can feed 9 billion people right now on the planet, right? This technology of using fertilizers. The downside is that when it rains, the excess phosphorus and nitrogen has to go somewhere. And where does it go? Well, it goes into rivers and streams where photosynthetic bacteria, plankton or algae, they increase at such a rapid rate because there's so many nutrients or so much phosphorus and nitrogen that they create kind of a blanket barrier between the top of the water and the underneath. And as these plankton or algae die, well, both, as they both die, the process of decomposition requires oxygen. And so, underneath this blanket of algae on top of the water, you get an oxygen poor environment underneath. And the process of poisoning by nutrients of an aquatic ecosystem is what we call eutrophication. Um, at least in the United States and most European countries, we've gotten a lot better about point source, finding the source of these type of pollutants and making sure that this doesn't happen, and planting buffer crops to prevent the offlow of or the runoff of nitrogen and phosphorus into the aquatic ecosystem. But it still happens, and it's still a real event, and it's still something that needs to be kept an eye on. All right, so back to that first focus question. How can the decline of a single species affect an ecosystem? Well, there's a lot of things leading to decline of species that we've talked about, and hopefully this question is one that you are now much more equipped to answer. Thank you so much for listening.